Learning languages used to be an expensive hobbies with bulky textbooks and DVD audio courses. Nowadays things have become a lot easier and space efficient on the learner side, and anyone with an internet connection is able to learn whatever they like, including languages. This is probably one of my favourite things about the internet, this freedom of knowledge which allows people to do things they never would have done before. As a child, I became very used to language learning for free, especially since I was learning a relatively uncommon language like Japanese. I didn't have access to physical shops that sold products in Japanese near me, and my parents didn't really trust buying things online, so I basically just had to make do with what I could find on the internet. Luckily, I was a kid with a lot of free time on my hands, so it wasn't too difficult to figure something out. I'm going to focus on my Japanese journey because I passed the JLPT N2 after around 4 years of self-study without ever spending any money on any resources. And I want to show all of you how you can get to a decent level in Japanese without spending any money. I'll give advice that can be applied to any language, but also specifically tell you about the free resources that helped me in my Japanese journey, so stick around to the end of the video if you want to see them. I also want to add that language learning certainly is easier and probably faster if you do have the money for books or lessons. Of course, this all depends on the person, because you can spend £1,000 on books, but if you never read them, you'll never get anywhere. And someone who does stuff for free, like watches YouTubers or does language exchanges, can get to a very high level. But in general, you're buying a way to not work quite as hard. Not that there's anything wrong with learning for free, I mean it's what I did and what I prefer even now, and you can get surprisingly far. In general, I think you don't need to spend money at the beginner stage in any common language, just because there's so much out there for free on the internet for beginners in every popular language. But now on to my tips for learning for free. The internet is a wonderful place to learn just about anything, and if you know how to use it, you can get just about anywhere. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm some sort of tech whiz or that I know everything about the internet, because that's very much not true, but this entire video is basically going to revolve around using it. You're probably going to have a lot of channels and websites that you'll be using during your language learning journey. It'll help a lot if you have a good system of bookmarking going on to help you stay organised. On YouTube as well, you can arrange some of your favourite content into playlists, and on Instagram and Twitter you can bookmark helpful posts, and you can create groups of bookmarks on Instagram as well to stay organised. This may seem very obvious, but it needs to be separate from your other bookmarks and other content, because if you're going to be language learning for a while, which you need to be to get to a high level, you're going to accrue lots of resources and contents that you're going to want to look back on. It's good to start with an organised system, because trying to organise it later is very annoying, and that's coming from experience. Make sure that everything is connected to a Google account or whatever sort of drive that you use, so if you switch accounts for whatever reason, you don't lose all of your stuff. To add on to that, make sure that you do bookmark things and keep track of everything that you do. Some of your resources might end up being like super obscure web pages that you may never find again if you don't bookmark them. I've personally had the experience of losing track of a lot of useful things for Japanese because I was young and I didn't care about keeping track of everything, despite knowing that I had a horrible memory. So don't make that mistake and bookmark everything, even if you don't like it at the time, because you can just go through your bookmarks later and delete it if you don't like it, or you might come back and realise that it was actually quite helpful and you end up using it in the future. To find the best resources, you need to be ready to find them anywhere. This could be a new website that you see an ad for, it could be an account on social media that you randomly get recommended, it could even be a flyer for a language meetup in your city that you see on your way home. Language resources come in different shapes and sizes, and you never know which new TV show or random book in a charity shop might be your next learning opportunity. It might not be easy to find good resources, but if you keep looking, there'll always be something. I personally find a lot of the websites that I'll show you at the end of this video just from randomly searching terms like Japanese language learning or things like Japanese grammar, Japanese vocabulary, so you can give that a try. You can also try searching those terms in Japanese, and this can be applied to any language. For YouTube, it's helpful to have a separate YouTube account for your language learning, and even better to have separate accounts for each language that you're learning, because then your homepage becomes a goldmine for relevant and useful content. When you put in a lot of time and effort into a product, it makes sense that you want to monetize it. So the resources that are not monetized tend to be a bit variable in terms of quality. Of course, there are lots of great resources that are free, but you will find some that are incomplete or have unappealing design choices. Now, this doesn't mean that you must settle for rubbish. Like, if it doesn't work or it's very low quality, let it go. You're just wasting your own time, and it's not like you paid for it anyway, so it's not a waste to stop using the resource. One thing that will pretty much always be found for free is a dictionary from your target language to English. I've linked some for Japanese at the end of this video, but there's so many out there and they're just a quick Google away. There are many ways to make use of a dictionary. Aside from just looking up a word, some dictionary apps have a save feature where you can keep interesting or difficult words to study later. Most of them also include example sentences for every entry, which becomes very useful if you're trying to make flashcards. A lot of words have several meanings, so you need to keep track of the context to properly utilise a dictionary. If you're at an intermediate to advanced level, you can start using a monolingual dictionary, which is one where the definitions are also in your target language. These are also available online, and it helps keep your head in your target language and understand nuances that may be lost in translation. However, it's also quite difficult, so you can start by only doing it every once in a while, or looking at words that you already know the meaning of, just to see how it would be defined in your target language. On a related note, a thesaurus can also be a great help to you at a high level. You may not have somebody to tell you that you use the same words every time you speak or write, but if you're starting to notice that your active vocabulary is stagnant, a thesaurus can help you enrich your speech. Just make sure to check that the words that you decide to use can still be used in the same way, and there isn't a significant change in nuance, which can sometimes be the case with synonyms. You're going to have to be your own teacher, so it's important to keep track of the things that you get wrong. An easy way to do this is with a notebook, writing down everything you get corrected on or can't say. Then you go back every once in a while to relearn from them. You can also use a software like Notion to help you keep track of this, basically anywhere that you know that you'll get back to it, because that's the key part. If you don't go over your mistakes again, you're not going to learn from them, and you're going to keep on repeating the same thing over and over again. You should also try to get the things you write or say corrected using either a language exchange partner, a more advanced language learner, or a site like Hi Native. This feedback is crucial in not cementing errors into the basics of the language, which get harder to fix the further you go along. I'd actually recommend holding back on trying to produce the language until you've immersed enough to have a good understanding of the fundamentals for this reason. You're not going to be paying for language lessons, so how do you get that much needed speaking practice? Well, by making friends. Use language exchange sites and apps like HelloTalk and Tandem to find someone that you can practice with. I'm personally not the biggest fan of apps like these as an introvert. I find it exhausting trying to find someone who works with me and that I can get along with, all while avoiding all the weird people on there. But there are plenty of people who manage to make friends or at least get some practice out of them, so give it a try. I recommend some other language exchange sites that I personally use, so stick around to the end of the video. Check out language-related clubs in your school or university if that's a possibility. Also check out language meetups in your city. Just search your target language and your city and see if you can find anything. But remember to be very careful if you're going to meet people in real life. Bring someone you know with you and always meet people in public areas. And if something sounds fishy, trust your gut and don't go. You can also practice with other language learners. If you don't know anybody in person, there are large language learning communities on Instagram, Twitter, or Discord. If you interact with some of the other users, you're sure to find someone with a similar level who you can talk to, or just someone who can support you and hold you accountable. So you don't want to make friends with other people. Me neither. But there's one person who's always there to listen to you, and that's yourself. I naturally talk to myself a lot, so it's very easy for me to talk to myself in my other languages. I've never found anything wrong or weird about talking to yourself. It's a great way to get practice if you're nervous or don't have anyone else to practice with. It can also help a lot to get your thoughts out of your head and make them real, which makes it easier to notice mistakes you may be making or any difficulties in pronunciation. Sometimes I pretend to have a conversation with a friend. Sometimes I repeat sections of media I watch that I find funny or interesting. It doesn't really matter as long as you're trying to keep a continuous line of dialogue and pay attention to what you're saying to notice where you struggle. Immersion will be a lifeline during your studies and should take up a significant amount of your time. For me, the main reason I am where I am in Japanese is because I would spend 8 hours a day watching YouTubers in Japanese and reading ebooks. If you don't have that sort of time, and I only did because I was a kid and I was waking up early and sleeping late and had no other responsibilities, just try and fit as much time as possible listening and reading in your target language. A quick way to get a bit of immersion is to change your device languages. This might be a bit difficult when you're a beginner, but since you likely use your devices quite a lot, you'll eventually learn what all the words mean. You can also change your region on social media to get different recommendations. I clearly remember at the beginning of 2017, when I decided to learn Japanese seriously, I changed my YouTube region to Japan. I then checked the trending section and found a bunch of new YouTubers that I ended up being obsessed with, and they became a big part of my routine. Social media can be a great place to refine your language skills. If you're a beginner, you can follow a bunch of other language learners for tips, motivation, or accountability at the most difficult stage of the journey. You can also write stuff on a platform like Twitter and ask people to correct you. As you get more advanced, you can follow content creators who make interesting content that you're interested in, like knitting or fitness, for example. I personally love to use Twitter as an advanced French learner as a way to keep up with the new slang and trends in the French-speaking world. It was super useful when I'd go over to watch YouTube videos or TV shows and notice the slang terms being used. It's always easier to recognise something that you hear when you see it written before. However, I will have to say there are a lot of spelling and grammatical errors out there on social media. You've probably noticed them when you look at posts in English, and you need to be aware that people make those same kind of mistakes in other languages. Sometimes someone will reply with a correction, but a lot of the times there won't be anything because it's very obvious to native speakers what they meant. So always be careful if you're copying any content you'll see on social media. Try to surround yourself in as much content as you can, which includes films and music as well. Music was a big part of the reason that I continued to learn Japanese after the initial rush, and is a big part of my language routine now. If you watch any of my language goals videos, you probably see translation and transcription of songs as a main part of my routine for Japanese. And this is an amazing free activity that's great for your listening and vocabulary skills. All you need to do is listen to the song and write all the lyrics that you can discern without worrying too much about accuracy and spelling. Once you're done, go over it again while listening to the song to try and fix spelling or any other mistakes you may have made, and then you look up the lyrics and correct it. Most songs released recently will have their lyrics available on the internet or even through your music player. After transcribing the songs, I usually attempt to translate it as well. Again, this doesn't have to be super perfect or coherent, it's just an exercise in comprehension basically, understanding what the lyrics are and writing them out in your native language. And you can also do this with clips from movies, TV shows, YouTube videos, or even live streams for an extra challenge. And if you're doing this with Japanese, you can first start by transcribing the songs in hiragana only, or even katakana only if you're practicing how to write out the syllabaries. Then once you get better and once you learn more, you can start writing out lyrics in kanji. A lot of lyrics are quite simple and they don't have any very complicated kanji, so it should not be too difficult to get through. It's a lot easier at an intermediate or advanced level to get immersion because you can just use native content and it's very plentiful on the internet. But even as a beginner, there are plenty of YouTube channels and accounts that are made for beginners. They're usually easier to find than advanced content too. A quick search on Google or any social media for beginner Japanese or any other language will show you a bunch of creators who make that sort of content. You may not be able to buy Japanese books, but if you have a Netflix subscription, you can use it to watch shows in your target language. And this applies to anything that you have access to that isn't necessarily for language learning. Have a library card? Go see if there are any language learning books for your target language. Have a games console? See if any of the games that you play can be switched into your target language. I personally got my first Japanese textbooks, the Tobira ones, from coming first place in a Japanese speech contest that I had decided to enter on a whim. It didn't cost anything and it was hosted online, so I thought it'd be super simple to just test out my Japanese skills, and it paid off. So keep an eye out for any other ways you can get some language learning materials. Some companies or influencers also do giveaways, which is also a good way to get your hands on some resources. You're probably not living in Japan and you'll probably be missing out on Japanese content which is region blocked. This is especially true on sites like Netflix where content can be region locked. If you already use a VPN, it can be a great way to change up your recommended sites and videos wherever you go on the internet. There are plenty of free VPNs available as well for both mobile and desktops if you search on Google. Like I said at the beginning of this video, spending money on resources does tend to help you learn a bit faster, especially since you spend a lot less time looking for resources, and the resources you have access to tend to be specifically made for language learners, instead of having to improvise. So you'll have to keep that in mind when you're setting your goals or visualising your progress. You might not be as fast as the other language learners that you see on the internet, but that's completely fine. Everyone has their own journey, and what's important is that you keep on going. You never know what those other language learners get up to if you're only seeing their posts on social media, so it's important not to compare your journey to anybody else's. This doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but it's worth a try because most spaced repetition softwares are free and easy to use. You have Memrise, Quizlet, but a lot of people who learn Japanese swear by Anki. I also used Anki a lot on my Japanese learning journey, and weirdly enough, I struggle to use it for any other language. You can create your own decks, which I recommend, but there are also loads of freely available decks on pretty much all of the different sites and apps out there for you to use. And this ties in with my other tip to learn from your mistakes. If you make flashcards with corrections to the mistakes you've made, very soon these concepts will be engraved in your brain. So now on to the specific sites and apps that helped me get to the level I have today. I can't cover all of the resources, so share any others that you know in the comments down below. After compiling this list for my bookmarks, I've realised that it has a lot of resources that are not very accessible for beginners. This is because when I was a beginner, I was around 12 to 13 and I didn't properly keep track of the sites that I was using. I've tried to add some, but I don't want to put too many sites that I've never used or don't remember using. So if you know of any more beginner-friendly websites, I'd really appreciate if you left a comment down below. And of course, all of the links to the sites that I show will be in the description. I want to first mention that YouTube is an amazing resource for a lot of free learning or immersion videos, and it's one of the main tools that I use even now to improve my Japanese. And I made a video about a bunch of different Japanese YouTubers that you can use to learn, and I invite you all to check that out in the description because it has a lot of material for all levels. We're now moving on to apps. Now, I'm not the biggest app user. On my phone, I only really use more general apps like YouTube or Netflix, for example, and dictionary apps. I don't tend to use ones made specifically for language learning because I find a lot of them stop after the beginner level, and I'm beyond that in both of the languages that I'm actively learning right now. And I also don't really like to be told what to learn when. I like to be able to have a lot of freedom to pick what I want to learn when I want to learn it, because I don't really learn for any specific reason. So I tend to go into modes where I just want to try out one thing. I want to learn about one specific topic and then I want to learn about another one. And learning things through an app means that I'm stuck on whatever the next chapter in the app is. But my point is that I don't really have a lot of experience using apps, so let me know what your favourite app is in the comment section. So there are plenty of apps that I mentioned before in the video, like Memrise, Quizlet and Anki, which are all the spaced repetition apps, and HelloTalk and Tandem are apps for language exchange. There's also Duolingo. When I started to learn Japanese, it wasn't a language on Duolingo, so I've never used it for Japanese specifically, but I have used it for other languages, and while I sort of enjoyed it, it wasn't really my style of learning. But I know that that sort of fun game-like interface can be very good in motivating a lot of people to learn, and I think that in itself is a good thing. Anything that keeps you coming back to the language every single day is a good thing, even if I don't particularly enjoy it myself. However, I have heard that Duolingo tends not to be so great with any language that has a different writing system, but give it a try. Back when I had an Android, my go-to dictionary was a dictionary called Akebi, and it is very good in that it has not only definitions for all the words, but it also classifies them to their JLPT level, and you can save words into lists and review them like flashcards. And it also has a separate section where it has all of the kanji separated by JLPT level. So if you wanted to, you could go through all of the kanji and you can practice them like flashcards by writing them out. And I don't really recommend this past like N3 because you don't really need to know how to write out 1,000 kanji by hand, but it can be a great way of learning to memorize them. Now that I have an iPhone, I use a dictionary called Shirabe Jisho, and it's quite similar to Akebi. When you look up a word, you can see how common it is. If you look up a kanji, you can see its JLPT level. It shows you the stroke order. It also has lists of kanji separated by JLPT level and lists of words as well, which can also be helpful. While I was studying for the JLPT, I was looking for some practice, And I found an app called Migi, which has JLPT practice questions separated by topic, and I found this quite useful. As with all of these apps, they're a lot more useful for the language knowledge section, like the kanji and vocabulary and grammar sections, than the listening or reading sections, though you can find a lot of listening exams on YouTube. So I basically used this app a lot for the kanji and vocabulary sections. You can find more apps like it just searching the App Store. Now moving on to the bulk of the resources, which are going to be websites. Now these have been accumulated over many years of learning Japanese, but it's not even a full list because there's a lot of them that have been lost to the mists of time on old devices that I didn't bother to back up. But I'm hoping that you'll find these at least a bit useful. People who are more advanced might find this more useful than beginners. There are not a lot of very obvious resources out there for advanced learners, and I honestly struggled a lot to find these sort of resources. I'm going to first start with dictionaries. First we have my lovely reliable Weblio, and I also have the app on my phone, but you need an internet connection to use it. Whereas the other dictionary apps that I use are offline, and I usually prefer them that way. Weblio is a monolingual dictionary, so the definitions will also be in Japanese. So if you find that too difficult, I also have some Japanese to English dictionaries that I'm going to mention. But first there's Goo, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which is also another monolingual dictionary. Then we have Jisho, which is my go-to Japanese to English dictionary, and it's a website that I use quite often when I'm reading the news. Then there's Takoboto, which is a site, which is a dictionary, but it's also like an app that you can download onto your laptop, which I have done. And they have a grammar section on the site as well, though I personally haven't never used it. Another one that I've used before is Japandict, which is another Japanese to English dictionary. And these are just my personal favourites, but if you type just Japanese to English dictionary, there's so many that'll come up, so you can go through a lot of them and see which ones that you personally like, the ones that you think are most useful. And now on to reading. I'm trying to push myself to read more books in Japanese, but when I do read online, it's usually the news, and I use the site NHK News. It's just the standard news site. It's good in the sense that it doesn't have a paywall like a lot of news sites do nowadays. It's always great to keep up with the news. I try to do it quite often, and it's great practice for advanced learners. The NHK also has an easy news site where they simplify the news down and add furigana on top, and it's made specifically for Japanese learners, so that can be an alternative for you if you're just getting into reading the news or if you're at a lower level. In a similar vein, there's BuzzFeed Japan. Now, I personally am not the biggest fan of BuzzFeed content, but it can be fun every once in a while to sort of see what sort of stuff they have going on. They have quizzes and like not very serious articles, which can sometimes be more fun to read than the actual news. So I have checked that site out a bit and thought it might be interesting for you. BuzzFeed actually has a lot of websites in a lot of different languages, so if you have any other target languages, BuzzFeed could actually be a surprisingly useful resource. Another site that I like to use is Matcha, which is a sort of magazine about travel and culture. It has a lot of short articles about different areas in Japan and different sort of cultural events, and it also has an easier version of the website with furigana and simplified versions of those articles. Another magazine style website is Hirogaru, which is separated into different topics and basically talks a lot about Japanese culture and explains it. Then we have a website that I talked about in my JLPT video, one that I used a lot in the run up to the JLPT, which is a website that is basically a fan translation of the Sherlock Holmes books, which is very good. If you're a fan of Sherlock Holmes like I am, this can be a great resource. The only real problem is that the books themselves are quite difficult, so you definitely need like an N2 level of kanji especially to get through all of the books. And then we have Monogatari, which is a website where people can upload their own stories. A bit like Wattpad, but these are usually original stories. It's not very common to find fan fiction on that site. And these can be really interesting to go through if you're a fan of those kind of sites. It is important to note that Because these are user submitted stories, they might not be entirely correct. There might be errors in spelling or grammar that might not have been caught by the publisher of the story. So it is important to be careful when you're reading them to not internalize any sort of errors. The good thing is that they're usually easier than regular novels because they're usually short stories written by regular people who aren't going to write in a very literary style. Also, just as a fun fact, if you're familiar with the Japanese artist YOASOBI, a lot of their songs, almost all of their songs I believe, are based off short stories, and a lot of those short stories come from this site. And recently they actually started asking for people to submit stories that they could turn into songs, and I think that's quite a unique concept and it's really cool. So you can actually read some of the original stories that the songs are based off. For example, their most popular song, Yoru ni Kakeru, which is also their debut single, was based off a short story written by Hoshino Mayo, which is called Thanatos no Yuwaku, and I'll try and find that short story and link it down below. I remember reading it when it first came out and it was really quite interesting, and it's very short as well and very easy to understand, so I do recommend you check it out. Another site that you might find useful is a site called Aozora, which is basically a website where there are a bunch of ebooks which are Japanese or translations of foreign books that are in the public domain. So they're usually quite old and as a result quite difficult to read. But if you're into classics, Japanese classics, you're very likely to find them on Aozora. For example, if you read a lot of Natsume Soseki, a lot of his books are on the site, and I've linked Yume Juya, which is one of his most popular works and one that I personally have read and enjoyed, down below. But now moving on to sites that are focused on grammar, vocabulary, or the JLPT. So first we have Imabi, which gives short bite-sized grammar lessons separated into general, beginner, intermediate and advanced levels. Then we have Nihongo Den, which gives a lot of grouped vocabulary and it's more focused towards beginners. We have the Tobira website, which is sort of support for the textbook, where you can find kanji, vocabulary and grammar exercises and lists to follow along with the textbooks, but you technically don't actually need them to go through the exercises. There's JLPT Sensei, which is focused on the JLPT and has comprehensive lists of grammar and kanji and vocabulary needed for each level. We have Taekim's Grammar Guide, which is a fairly comprehensive textbook which can serve as a reference for basically all the grammar that you need to know to become reasonably fluent in Japanese. There's a site JLPT Study, which is basically just lists of vocabulary, grammar and kanji for the levels N5 to N2. And there's Japanese Pod 101, which you're probably all familiar with. That has a bunch of podcasts and resources that you can print out to focus on your Japanese, which is also more suited for beginners. And I'm going to talk about some sites that are for Japanese kids or teens. So if you're at least an intermediate level, a lot of the great free resources will be websites and YouTube channels, which are meant for Japanese speaking kids and teens. Now this may be a bit difficult at first because you'll need to navigate the sites entirely in Japanese, and a lot of them will be teaching stuff for school, so it may not be all very useful and relevant to you, but I found them very, very helpful just in my Japanese learning journey, especially when it comes to kanji, so it's worth giving it a try. So first we have a site that's called News, which stands for Nihongo Education Contents Web Sharing System, and I actually think this website might be for teachers, but it basically has a bunch of Japanese learning resources and teaching resources, I think. The entire site is in Japanese and it's basically just a place where people share a bunch of documents. I've linked a couple of helpful pieces of content that I found on that site. I was studying for the JLPT N2 when I found this site, and they have a bunch of quizzes on it, which can be quite difficult to find for the JLPT. So I've linked them all down below. The next site is called Naze Nani Gakushu Sodan, and it is basically separated into subjects, school subject and year in elementary, and it's basically meant to answer any sort of questions that might come up when a kid is studying. For example, in science you can ask, why do plants need sunlight to grow? And in history they can ask, how do we know things that happened in the past? So they're fairly simple questions, and they're explained in a way that's meant to make it understandable for little kids. So it can be very useful to sort of learn a little bit about the world and also brush up on your Japanese. There isn't that much kanji as well because it's meant for little kids, and they come in the form of little PDFs, so they're usually quite short, and you could take each question as a little lesson. The next site is NHK School. So this is basically another subsection of the NHK website that's specifically for kids from elementary school to high school as well, and it's a collection of lessons on a range of school subjects, and you can pick your school year at the top, so depending on your level you can look at resources for little kids and also all the way up to middle and high schoolers. And Yahoo Kids is basically the same concept. It has a bunch of interesting fact sheets and information on a bunch of different school subjects. The only difference with this site is that you'll need a VPN to access it, as it's not available outside of Japan. The next site is called Chibimusu Doriru, which has a bunch of printable exercises for different years and subjects. I personally really enjoy the kanji prints, like the kanji worksheets, and I use them a lot in my kanji learning journey because I just like writing out kanji. I find them quite fun. So I've used those a lot, but they have them for basically all the subjects, including stuff like maths and English, even though that might not be very useful to a lot of people. And the last site in this section is the Yamaguchi Learning Support Program, which is basically extra study materials meant for elementary and middle schoolers in a wide variety of school subjects. And now we're moving on to some miscellaneous sites. The first one is just the website where you can find all of the shared decks for Anki, because you have to download them from the site if you want to use them on the app, and also even on the desktop app as well. And I've linked a website which is an Anki deck for the Dictionary of Japanese Grammar, which is sort of another textbook similar to the Takim's grammar guide, basically a comprehensive list of a lot of grammar. And I personally don't really like learning grammar through flashcards, but since Japanese grammar tends to be specific words and structures rather than tenses, it can actually be quite useful to use flashcards to go through them. So if you think that might be useful to you, the site's in the description. The next site I'm going to talk about is Nihongo Iina, which collates a bunch of other Japanese resources around the web in different categories. So if you haven't found what you're looking for here, you can check out that site, and it has a bunch of different websites and apps that it will lead you to. They might not necessarily be free, but if you check out their website, there's a lot of stuff there, so it's quite useful. And then one thing I like to do is journal in Japanese and write quite a bit. So there's a site that I found that had a bunch of writing prompts. It was meant to be one for every day of the year, but it stops after September for some reason. I guess they just didn't want to update it. But it's still quite a lot of prompts, and they're quite difficult as well. So they're like proper journaling prompts, so you might find them a bit too difficult if your level in Japanese is quite difficult. But if you're looking for a challenge or just want to do some introspection, you can check them out. I found another site that had prompts for elementary school kids, so that's much simpler. And the topics that they talk about is just stuff like your favourite food, your favourite memory and stuff like that, which is a lot easier to turn into like a daily or weekly journaling session. The next three websites are basically just the Google podcast sites for 3 news podcasts. So I mentioned that I liked reading the news. I also occasionally like listening to it, not as much as I like reading it, but I think that listening to the news is also quite helpful because it's quite clear, the audio is always very good, and the speakers are always enunciate very well. So I've linked below the sites for the TBS podcast, the NHK podcast, and the SBS podcast, and they're all news sites in Japan. And I mentioned before how you can use Hi Native to get questions answered about your target language and your production in target language, so I linked that down below. And finally, we have the 2 language exchange websites that I like to use. The first one is Interpals, which looks quite old-fashioned, but I found it's a quite nice site. I like websites more than apps because they feel a lot slower paced, It doesn't feel like someone's constantly trying to reach you all the time, and you don't get a lot of people trying to talk to you. I mean, you do, but it feels less invasive to have like a message in your inbox than like a text that comes to you. Nowadays, I use the site Conversation Exchange quite a lot, and this is actually where I've met most of my language exchange partners over the past couple of years. I can't even explain why I like this more than HelloTalk, because it's essentially the same. You upload your profile, you get contacted, but the fact that it's not like an app, I feel like there's not as many people on there, which means that there's not as many weirdos. Like, I personally have not encountered any sort of weird people on there, or any sort of weird... I've gotten a couple of weird messages, but it's far less than I used to get on HelloTalk, so I've been enjoying my experience there a lot more. So if you want to, you can check out those sites and see if they work for you. I think one thing I like about Conversation Exchange as an introvert is that because it's not like an app and it doesn't feel like you're texting someone, it feels a lot easier to take your time and write a long message and really sort of get to know someone rather than doing like small talk. And that's a lot easier for me rather than apps like HelloTalk and Tandem. It feels more like sending emails rather than sending text messages, which is just something to consider. So that's going to be it for this video. I definitely wasn't expecting it to be so long, but I hope I've covered enough to help you in your journey of learning Japanese for free. Leave any questions in the comment section down below, and I or other commenters will try to help you out. And leave your experiences of learning for free down below, Japanese or otherwise. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.